Devor Maha Accorda. Hello, I'm Jerry O'Neill, and I invite you to join me on the delayed second leg of a global mystery tour, in which we will explore the worldwide influence of Ireland's musical and literary heritage, concentrating mostly on Ireland's forgotten bard, Thomas Moore. We will meet some remarkable characters and hear the fascinating and sometimes incredible stories associated with his poems and ballads. So if you have your boarding pass ready, we'll soon be ready for takeoff. I suppose we're all familiar with Irishmen who have left their stamp on various forms of literature, such as George Bernard Shaw in drama or William Butler Yeats in poetry, both of whom were Nobel Prize winners. Then there was James Joyce, who wrote Ireland's most well-known but least read novel, Ulysses. Bram Stoker penned the world's most famous horror story, Dracula, the Hollywood adaptations of which have struck terror into generations of moviegoers. But who could name the Irishman who was one of the pioneers of the modern travel writing genre? Isaac Weld was born in Dublin in 1774. He had an interesting family pedigree, to say the least. One of his ancestors, Thomas Weld, joined the Puritans and emigrated from England to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, where he collaborated in the writing and printing of the first English language book published in the New World. This was called the Bay Psalmbook, a translation from the Hebrew to English. The Pilgrim Fathers had settled in Massachusetts to have freedom to practice their own branch of Christianity. However, they were not very willing to extend this freedom to others. They soon fell into acrimonious disputes on minor points of theology. Thomas Weld became involved in some particularly toxic disagreements with other Puritans, which led to him leaving the New World and returning to England. He brought back his son. This was Edmund Weld, who subsequently came to Ireland, where he established the Irish branch of the family. He came as a preacher to help save the heathen Irishry from perdition. He first settled in Kinsale, then spent some time in Blarney Castle before moving to Dublin. He later became Oliver Cromwell's private chaplain, no less. By the 18th century, the Welds had abandoned their dissenter roots and produced a series of vicars in the more easygoing Church of Ireland. At the young age of 21, Isaac Weld took off for the New World, where he spent 2 years travelling alone, from the major urban centres to the edge of the wilderness in the underdeveloped West. He published a very readable and detailed account of his travels, called Wells' Travels, through the states of North America and the provinces of Upper and Lower Canada during the years 1795, 1796, and 1797. Despite the unwieldy title, this book, published in 1799, was an immediate bestseller. It went through many editions and was translated into a number of languages. It brought the young author Isaac Weld fame, but no great remuneration. Not realizing it was going to be so successful, he had sold the rights to the publishers for a very modest sum. The book is still an important source document for students and researchers investigating this period of North American history. But what is really interesting is that Isaac Weld had studied art. Some of his very detailed and accurate drawings of the landscape were included in the book and offered to Europeans the first widely disseminated images of the Niagara Falls. Thomas Moore carried a copy with him on his travels through North America a few years later in 1804, and it coloured his own descriptions and poems of the area. He was then 25 years of age and had at this stage already made a name for himself by scandalising and shocking British polite society with its first two poetic publications. His Odes of Anacreon were translations of the 6th century BC Greek poet of wine, women, and song. This gave him the nickname Anacreon Moore. His second collection, The Poetic Works of the late Thomas Little, Esquire. With the name Thomas Little, he makes a joke of his own very short stature. He was no taller than 5 foot, if that at all. And he alludes to his own name also. Thomas Moore sounds the same as the Gaelic Big Tom. In America, he records his impression of the majestic Niagara Falls with the famous quote, "Oh, bring the atheist here and he cannot return an atheist." Some decades later, when Niagara had become a popular tourist and honeymoon destination, another famous Irish literary figure, Oscar Wilde, was not so impressed by the grandeur of the scene, it appears, because his recorded quote was, "Every American bride is taken there, and the sight of the stupendous waterfall must be one of the earliest, if not the keenest, disappointments in American married life." How cynical is that? Moore alludes to the Great Falls in one of his poems thus: "Light above the rocks I play, where Niagara's starry spray frozen on the cliff appears like a giant's starting tears." Moore spent a number of days in the area, and seated under an ancient oak, he penned a short poem called Ballad Stanzas, extolling the enchanting beauty of the surroundings. Here is the first verse. "I knew by the smoke that so gracefully curled above the green elms that a cottage was near, and I said, if there's peace to be found in the world, a heart that is humble might hope for it here. It was noon, and on flowers that languished around, in silence reposed the voluptuous bee. Every leaf was at rest, and I heard not a sound but the woodpecker tapping the hollow beech tree." The poem was set to music, and both the poem and the song were hugely popular, and have been credited with creating such an idyllic image of the Canadian backwoods that it promoted tourism and was partially responsible for the great increase in immigration to Canada in the first decades of the 19th century. Of course, Moore only saw Canada in early autumn. Maybe if he overwintered, he might not have been so positive. The poem also ignores the physical hardships, the unrelenting toil, and the isolation involved in carving out farms from the wilderness. But this was the Romantic age, when such bucolic images of rural landscapes were in full vogue. It is interesting to compare Moore's "I knew by the smoke that so gracefully curled above the green elms that a cottage was near" with Wordsworth's "Wreaths of smoke sent up in silence from among the trees." This was from lines composed a few miles above Tintern Abbey. This poem had been published a few short years earlier in the groundbreaking Lyrical Ballads, a collaborative work published jointly by William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. This collection is regarded as being the work which heralded in the Romantic era in English literature. Here is a famous landscape painting illustrating the same theme: constables Haywain. This now priceless painting failed to find a buyer when first exhibited. When Moore was penning his Niagara poem, Beethoven was developing the same landscape theme in his glorious Pastoral Symphony. Here is a clip from the fifth movement, The Shepherd's Hymn. You really need headphones to get the best out of this. We now leave the banks. No, all this is just to put Moore's poem ballad stanzas in the context of his times, something which some of his less well-informed contemporary critics failed to do. We'll now leave the banks of the mighty St. Lawrence for a while to visit the city of Seville, on the banks of the Guadalquivir in Andalusia, Spain.
Non piagrai far valore amoroso e notte giorno girando belle tondo il riposo narcisetta arancina d'amor belle tondo il riposo narcisetta arancina.
That was from The Marriage of Figaro, one of the most popular operas of all time, composed by the Austrian Mozart, with a libretto in Italian, based on a French drama set in Spanish Seville. How cosmopolitan is that? The first performance took place at the Burg Theatre in Vienna on the 1st of May 1786, conducted by none other than Mozart himself on the keyboard. Among the cast playing two roles as Basilio and Don Curzio was one Michele O'Kelly. This was the Italian form of Michael Kelly, or Michael O'Kelly, a tenor from Dublin. He was the first man from Britain or Ireland to make a successful career singing in the major opera houses of the continent. The published record of his career, his reminiscences, give a vivid picture of many of the important composers, patrons, and opera stars of that era, and is nowadays used as a source document for historians and biographers. He later became a composer in his own right, as well as a promoter and manager, and became one of the most important figures in British theatre. For one of his operas, the 1801 Gypsy Prince, he chose as librettist the young Thomas Moore. How many of you were aware that Moore wrote the librettos for operas? This might be an opportunity to list his multifaceted talents. He was, of course, a poet and songwriter, but also a lifelong scholar and researcher, a satirist, a biographer, a multilingualist, a classicist, a translator, a pianist, a singer, an actor, an orientalist, an eroticist, and a novelist. Have you spotted anything missing from that impressive list? He never undertook drama for some reason. Moore also staunchly championed the cause of civil and religious liberties, not only in Ireland but worldwide, and often spoke out against slavery and the scandal of child labour. And last but not least, he was a mighty man for the crack. Great company, a gifted raconteur, but also a good listener. He had a charismatic personality. He charmed people wherever he went. One of his difficult tasks every day was how to refuse invitations without causing offence. Anyway, getting back to Michael Kelly, he also composed music for many poems, the most famous of which was the Woodpecker Ballad. And the lyrics, of course, were from Moore's poem Ballad Stanzas, written on the banks of the Niagara River and already quoted. The tree under which he was reputed to have composed this poem, known as Moore's Oak, became a pilgrimage site for tourists who chipped off bits of the bark as souvenirs. The tree, of course, died, and they continued taking bits until it had completely disappeared. Another tree has now taken its place. I wonder how many of the hundreds of Irish who visit Niagara every year know of that oak or take the trouble of visiting it. Unfortunately, the Woodpecker Ballad is not available online, but we need a musical interlude. I will play you a short snip from a classic Hollywood musical that has literary connections with both Niagara and Ireland.
I could have danced all night, I could have danced all night, and still have begged for more. I could have spread my wings and done 1,000 things I've never done before. I never know what made it so exciting. Why all at once my heart took flight. I only know when he began to dance with me, I could have danced, danced, danced.
That is the ravishing Audrey Hepburn in one of the most successful musicals of the 20th century, Lerner and Lowe's My Fair Lady. Audrey Hepburn, even though she was a reasonable singer herself, is not the voice here. The singer is Marnie Dixon, who was also the singing voice in a number of famous Hollywood movies of that era. This talk began with a mention of George Bernard Shaw, and of course he wrote Pygmalion, the play on which My Fair Lady is based. He also won an Oscar for the screenplay of the 1938 film version of Pygmalion. He didn't attend the ceremony and is reported as having said, "It's an insult for them to offer me any honour." Well, that is the Irish literary connection, but what is the Niagara connection? Very close to Moore's Oak is the picturesque historical town of Niagara-on-the-Lake, where you will find the Shaw Theatre. This is the second largest repertory theatre in all of North America. The purpose-built theatre building was built to house the annual George Bernard Shaw Theatre Festival, which showcases Shaw's extensive drama output. even though it has now broadened its repertoire. Here's a fine bronze statue of Shaw. How many theatres in Ireland stage any of Shaw's plays these days? So we have memorials to two of Ireland's cultural giants in Niagara. But surely Isaac Weld could also be celebrated. I would imagine that his travel book on North America did as much to publicise Canada as Moore's poem. I have been as careful as possible in researching this video, but if there are any errors, please let me know in the comments below. And apologies for the rough presentation, but I failed to master the tricks of video editing yet. Please press the thumbs up and the subscribe buttons. I hope to return to Moore's travel in North America at a later date. But on our next trip, we will visit the mysterious Orient for a change. Good evening, Slán agus beannacht. I hope you will join me then.